there's two types of limiting beliefs. There's a limiting belief that you're aware of, and there's a limiting belief that you're not. There's probably more, but we'll keep it nice and simple because that's the kind of guy I am. And I think, the biggest challenge for most people is they're working with a speed limiter on their car. They're in a race car, they're in a race, they're in competition, but they have no idea that they're running a system that can go a lot faster, if not for the fact that there's something throttling the engine's capacity to rev harder. When we look at limiting beliefs, there's to me, the most important thing that we need to do is become aware, and whether I'm talking about business or whether I'm talking about personal development or parenting or, anything to do with spirituality or health, I always, the cornerstone of all of my content is around consciousness. And I don't necessarily refer to consciousness in the context of a spiritual format, although, it lends itself to be applied there as well. I talk about consciousness in the context of literal awareness, like literally being, I wasn't aware of that. Because the human brain, it's a fascinating thing. It's a cognitive milestone. Its number one job is to filter vast volumes of information to prevent the organism, from essentially going into overwhelm, which, increases the probability of, something bad happening, which can prevent evolution. And so when you consider the human brain processes 16 trillion bits of information every 1 second, the average human being is aware of about 7 bits of that information. Maybe, if they're an elite conscious athlete, they might be aware of as much as 2,000 bits of information. So it's fair to say there's a lot going on in the environment. There's a lot going on in our brain that we are just completely oblivious to. And a huge part of that comes down to not only our behaviors, but more importantly, the way that we think. Because ultimately, our behaviors are a product of a psychology, an operating system. Our psychology is our operating system. And the way that psychology, the way that operating system is programmed will determine the behaviors, of the human. And I think the biggest challenge that a lot of people have is they have these unconscious beliefs, but they have these limiting beliefs, I should say, but there's just a very high degree of unconsciousness. There's a very high degree of ignorance. And so when you have, a limiting belief and you're not aware of it, you in most cases will assume that you're not the problem. You'll look extrinsically, you'll look out externally, you'll look at, outside factors. And, one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make, in every level of business is they approach success for the most part as an extrinsic pursuit. Well, once I achieve, once I do this on the outside, then I'll be successful. And then once I do this on the outside and then I'm successful, then I'll be happy. And, happiness becomes an extrinsic pursuit. Success becomes an extrinsic pursuit, not really, lending itself to the awareness for most people to understand that, when we look at success, it's an intrinsic game. When we look at happiness, it's an intrinsic game. And I know how cliche this sounds, but when you just look at the base, when you just look at the stats from positive psychology, from Seligman's work, we understand that, people who are already happy are 78% more likely to experience success in other areas of their life. Yet when you look at people's pursuit, and their goals to deal with their limiting beliefs, why do you want to do with this? Why do you want to remove limiting beliefs? Why do you want to, become better? Well, I want to achieve success. And if you could have success, what would that give you that I don't have right now? And they go, well, I'd be, what else? And ultimately, one of the things that I find people want is they want to be happy. And it's like, well, here's the catch, mate. If you're already happy, you're 78% more likely to achieve success. But if you're pursuing success as a pathway to happiness, it's going to be a very long, emotional, in most cases stressful, and uncomfortable game for you, because it does, what we experience on the outside is nothing more than, a manifestation of what's going on the inside. And limiting beliefs, make up a huge part of what we are able to see in our environment. Because the way a psychology is built in my world, and again, I like to keep things nice and simple. To me, a psychology is made up of 4 layers. The first layer of a psychology is the stories. It's the stories that we told, and that essentially becomes the code. And I say this to people, and a lot of people, at first they're a little bit surprised, but then once it lands, they realize the true nature of what I'm talking about. Like, we are $1 trillion supercomputer in a box. Like, we are probably the most sophisticated piece of biotechnology that this planet has ever seen. And so with that, we have enormous amounts of complexity, but we also have enormous amounts of function, that if we were to understand aspects of that complexity that would be able to, access. And one of those functions, that most people don't know how to access is how to use their brain effectively, because the brain is an operating system that when programmed effectively, is going to produce very predictable, very precise, in most cases, very consistent behaviors. But if people aren't producing predictable, consistent behaviors, in most cases, there's a limitation there. And those limitations are a product of those stories, because those stories, that's the first layer. That's how we absorb everything. We look to the world and people tell us stories. That's how, generations of trauma is passed down from generation to generation. Stories are being told. As kids, that's how we absorb information from the environment. We look at what's going on and we make a story in our head. We watch TV and stories are fed to us. But after a while, what our brain does is, our brain, being the efficient, cognitive miser that it is, it likes to create shortcuts. And this is where we get into beliefs, because you can't sit there and think about every story that you've ever been told about money. You can't sit there and think about every story that you've ever been told about good parenting or bad parenting or discipline, without it taking up an enormous amount of headspace and an enormous amount of energy. And so what the brain does, in its glory and levels of efficiency, is it creates these shortcuts in the form of icons that we call beliefs. And a belief, is applied to a psychology as a filtering system, so that we don't have to remember everything that we're thinking about, and we can just go, oh, that's right. That's what I believe. I don't have to remember or recall the story. But what's really interesting, and I tell this story all the time, when we talk about, behaviors that come from limiting beliefs, and in most cases aren't even ours. There's an old wives' tale about, a woman who's cooking a lamb roast, and every time she cooks a lamb roast, she cuts the end off the lamb roast before she puts it in the oven. And one day her husband says to her, honey, look, I notice every time we do a lamb roast, you always cut the end off it. Like, why? Just out of curiosity, what's that all about? And she goes, well, I don't know. That's what my mum used to do. And he goes, well, why did your mum do it? And she says, well, I don't know. And he goes, well, let's ring mum now and ask her, because I'm fucking curious, because you've been doing this for the last 10 years. And I've never once thought, why do you do it? Now I am. I want to know. And so they ring mum and they say, Mum, why do you cut the end off the lamb roast? And mum goes, well, because that's what your grandmother used to do. And they say, well, Grandma, what did Grandma do? And they go, well, I don't know, but this is what she always used to do. And so that's what I do. And so, okay, well, let's get Grandma on a three-way call. So they ring Grandma and they say, Grandma, you know how every time you cook a lamb roast, you cut the end off? Just out of curiosity, why did you do that? And they go, well, love, back in my day, we only had really small ovens. And the only way we could fit a leg of lamb in the oven was by cutting the end off it. Yet 2 generations later, they're still repeating the behaviors that are based on a belief system that is completely outdated. And so at some point we've got to become aware of, why are we doing this? And then start looking at what is the origin of that code? What is the origin of that programming? What is the origin of that story? And is it still, does that code, does that story still apply to today? To this day and age? And that's where, we start looking at the brain. And I don't know, I'm starting to have a lot of my own awarenesses around this, but I look at the brain very much like a bioorganic computer system. Like, it's $1 trillion of biotech in a box. If I could replicate you and put you on a factory line, that's $1 trillion idea right there. But by the nature of the way that the brain works, it's very programmable. If and you've only got to look at history to understand how programmable, our brains are to produce behaviors. And to give you, solid context around the nature of programmability. Gosh, there was a story I wanted to tell you. We look at computer science, and computer science for the last, let's call it since the 1950s, 1960s, maybe 1940s, they've been trying to replicate the processing power and the capabilities of the human brain, yet they haven't even come close. Quantum computing is the closest that we've become. But when you consider that most people get a better walkthrough for their iPhone than they do for their own operating system, it helps us understand why so few people really understand how to, utilize the technology that they've got, because no one, for the most part, has ever been shown how to use it.